Thank you, Jennifer. Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks for inviting me back. I didn't think I could get through 3 tries, but here I am. And thank you all for coming tonight. So this is the topic tonight: technology denial and the Sino-American rivalry. It's an unusual word, technology denial. That's actually the topic in the book, in that book over there. That's the topic of it, and that's exactly what the United States is trying to do. So I'll try to, tonight, explain to you what technology denial is and how it fits into this Sino-American rivalry. A lot of it centers right here in Taiwan. That's the flag of Taiwan. And you may not know this, but Taiwan is now the leader in the world in manufacturing the most advanced, efficient, integrated circuits of anywhere in the world. And I think you all have a little Taiwan in your pocket, at least I do. This phone is assembled in China. It's designed in California. And the integrated circuits that are in here are all made in Taiwan. Now we know Taiwan is in the news, but this, they don't talk about this so much in the news, about what's really going on inside Taiwan. So I'll put a plug in for this book at the beginning, and then I'll go back to it at the end. This book explains a whole lot about the chip wars between all the manufacturers around the world to get supremacy in these integrated circuits. And that ties in with this concept of technology denial. So first let me introduce what I'm going to talk about tonight, just so you, because there's a lot of confusing terminology, and I hope I don't lose you. So the US-China rapprochement resulted in a massive Chinese economic growth, which threatened the US economy. I'm sure we all feel it here, whether it's when we go into the store to buy a tool we see that's made in China, or we hear people lose their jobs because the jobs are outsourced in China. It has a huge effect on our economy. It's also made things more efficient in our economy. We can get this will help us lower inflation in the economy. But along the way, China started a rapid military expansion that threatens the United States' strategic position in East Asia. It's got the United States very upset. The United States has reconfigured all our armed forces to fight a war in China. We've been diverted by the war in the Middle East. And this is China's threatening Taiwan, but not only Taiwan, the South China Sea, the Philippines. And so there's a lot of concern about that, and of course, the United States defense planners. One of the approaches the United States became concerned that all these war machines rely on advanced technology, which is these integrated circuits. So the concern was that the manufacturing of integrated circuits had moved outside of the United States. We were losing our capability to make them ourselves. And so in 2022, the Congress passed what's called the CHIPS Act, which is to bring manufacturing of that back to the United States. So these are all the topics we're going to talk about in a few minutes. The US restricts key technology exports to China because we're trying to limit their ability, basically, to go to war with us. And we have the thing called the entity list, and I'll explain what the entity list is in the coming slides. We are trying now to block FDI, this means foreign direct investment in China, and especially in Chinese technology companies. A lot of American money going into Chinese tech companies. And you may be surprised if you check your 401k, check your Vanguard fund, you might find that you own some defense companies in China. And our government, our political representatives aren't too happy about that. Meanwhile, we do a lot of other business with China, and a lot of American companies want to continue doing business with China, so we somehow want to block their access to advanced technology, but keep the door open for other business. And that's a delicate walk that our government is trying to walk right now. So for example, 20% of Apple's sales are in China. 99% of Apple's production is in China. So this is from the Great Decisions book. I'm just going to put these questions up for you to think about. The whole idea of Great Decisions is we introduce a topic, and you guys discuss it and tell us what you think we should do. So the questions they have is China a national security threat or a business opportunity? Or is it both? If China's a national security threat, should we have the United States have a denial strategy to slow down China's economic development, or just its military development? If China's a national security threat and technology denial strategy is appropriate, how can we obtain better client compliance from U.S. businesses? Because when we're talking about all this, U.S. companies, you will see, are trying to work around the trade restrictions and sell these products to China. So they see what the regulations are. In some cases, they redesign their products so they're just underneath the limitation. They can still export them to China. So the question is, how do you get the U.S. companies on board with this? Should United States investors and their asset managers, like Vanguard, be prohibited from buying and owning Chinese defense companies? As I said, some of us very well may have defense companies in our 401ks. If China is a business opportunity, are there no products that should be sold to China? Where do we draw the line? And is the United States in a new Cold War with China? And is it a technology Cold War? So these are the questions that Great Decisions put in the book. I just copied this right out of the book. So let's start with the question of how do we get to this situation? It all started with a dinner in Shanghai in 1972, and I think you certainly recognize the man on the right. That's our President Richard Nixon in 1972. He's having dinner with China's very famous foreign minister, Zhou Enlai, and this dinner was what led to breaking the ice between the United States and China. Then there's the next day, Richard Nixon, he was very famous as an anti-communist fighter in his politics. And there he is shaking hands with Mao Zedong. And there's a lot of symbolism in his shaking hands because in 1952 at the Geneva Conference about what was going on in Vietnam that divided North and South Vietnam, Allen Dulles refused to shake Zhou Enlai's hands. So there's a lot of symbolism in this photograph. Then there's Richard Nixon and Pat Nixon at the Great Wall, all in 1972, so what's that, about 50-some years ago. That's how it all started. And China was coming to the end of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. The Chinese economy in 1976, when Mao died, was a complete mess. And this man named Deng Xiaoping, who had been demoted and imprisoned 3 times by Mao and his gang during the Cultural Revolution, was rehabilitated and emerged as the leader of China in 1977. And he came with he liked to speak in Chinese in general, speak oftentimes their language is filled with lots of little sayings. Some of them quite ancient. There's one called "Cross the river by feeling for the stones." It means you don't have to plan. We're going to just figure out how to get across here. And that's what they told people. We're going to develop the economy. And he's also famous for the saying, "Doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." So doesn't matter whether it was meaning it doesn't matter if the economic model is capitalism or communism, as long as it improves people's standard of living, this is a good thing. So Deng Xiaoping gets a lot of credit in China to this day for lifting Chinese people out of poverty and getting the whole economy moving. That started in '77. And you can see here, this is 1990 to 1980 to 2014. You can see the annual per capita income rose from 0 till a few years ago to $6,000 a person. China was in a shambles in 1976, and because of this economic development that we helped with, they got to be, it lifted lots of people out of poverty, and everybody was talking, this is great, because they have a lot of stake in keeping peace in the world, and people talked about the peaceful rise of China. So 500 million people were lifted out of poverty. In 2001, China was the first year China was in the World Trade Organization. They were admitted to the WTO. When I was there in the late 90s, they were preparing to be admitted, and there was a lot of excitement in China about getting into the WTO and all the opportunities it would create for China, and it did. You can see here that the GDP went almost up by 4 times in a 10-year period. So this is a massive increase in wealth and opportunity for the Chinese, and it was a happy time. Those of us who visited China, and we were working there part of the time, it was a period of optimism with the Chinese people that I don't think they feel so much today. Meanwhile, China's share of exports just got bigger and bigger. It grew from in 2004 from from less than 15% to more than 30% of global exports is coming out of China. They took the whole market away from everybody. But you can see here the United States share of global exports is continuing to decline. This is quite a setback for us because after the Second World War, when we were growing up, we were #1 in the world, but not anymore. So, meanwhile, there's the long-term trade. There's a big trade deficit between us and China, and this is still quite large. There was just a statistic in the news yesterday that U.S. trade with Mexico exceeds now U.S. trade with China. That was the first time that's happened. That was just announced since I finished this presentation. So that is changing for some of the reasons we're going to talk about in this presentation. And all this means that 3.7 million jobs were lost to China since 2001. So that's a lot of jobs, and I think the industries around here have felt it. The industries all over the United States and all over the world have felt it. China's also embarked on a mercantilist strategy to be #1 in key technologies, and they're really focusing on being the best in the world, for example, in artificial intelligence and robotics and aviation. In power systems, I can tell you they've made a lot of progress, and I would say in many ways their technology, particularly in high voltage transmission, is ahead of what we have in the United States and what they have in Europe. They're also leaders in facial identification. So they're trying to get these key technologies under their belt so they can be the leaders in the world of this. And so we are in a real technology race with the Chinese. This poor country, 50 years ago, has stood up and given us a big challenge. So today, what started out as a peaceful rise of China, we find ourselves now in a adversarial relationship with China. And we have a lot of differences with China. First and foremost is Taiwan. As you know, after Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan a couple of years ago, the Chinese put an air and sea blockade around the island, and that's what this map is trying to show here. These are areas where they put naval and air blockades, trying to simulate a full blockade of the island to try to intimidate the Chinese, and there's been other blockades since then. And Xi Jinping has announced that by 2027, China is going to retake Taiwan. They see that as that was taken away from them in 1895 by the Japanese, and they see that as a historical rectification of a wrong that was inflicted on them in the past. Meanwhile, we pledged to defend Taiwan, so we are in a collision course with China. In Xinjiang, far northwest China, we've heard about the Uyghurs, persecution of the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are Turkic people. They're not Chinese. They don't look like Chinese. If you know what Turks look like, they look a lot like Turkish people. Joan and I have been there a couple times. And they're Muslim people, and historically, Xinjiang has tried to separate from China through the millennia. Over more than 1,000 years, there's been instances of independent Uyghur kingdoms in northwest China. They've tried to separate, and they're now trying to separate, and the Chinese really clamped down on that in the last couple of years. They started these re-education camps, and now there's talk that Chinese exports are using prison labor, Uyghur prison labor, to make cheap goods to export. So this is another area that we're contesting with the Chinese. Then China's embarked on a nuclear program to make parity in nuclear weapons with the United States. Up to now, they've had a position that they just needed a minimal deterrence. Now they want as many nuclear weapons in their arsenal as we have in our arsenal. And then there's the South China Sea. China came out with a set of maps showing what's called the 9-dash line. And they claim all the South China Sea as their own. Now, South China Sea is where the most maritime, it's the busiest maritime traffic point in the world. China's militarized coral reefs and made them like fixed-base aircraft carriers to control access to the sea. It's also the area of major oil and gas deposits and major fisheries. So the neighboring countries, for example, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, they're not happy about this at all. So they're trying to, they're protesting what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese really haven't enforced it. They're proclaiming it and harassing Philippines, for example. They regularly harass Philippines fishing boats, but they haven't actually imposed a blockade. Meanwhile, we send our fleet regularly on what's called freedom of navigation issues through the South China Sea. We'll just take a mistake by one person, an awful lot of close calls, that could have potentially ignite a war. This is probably the real hot point, flashpoint between the United States and China right now. Then there's Hong Kong. Hong Kong was annexed by the UK, by the British, from China. It was annexed. It was just a little island, a little fishing village in 1842, and they were given a forever mandate to rule Hong Kong. It was ceded to England as part of the settlement of the Opium Wars. And the Chinese feel want that back. They consider that a historical wrong. So in 1987, Margaret Thatcher negotiated that they would turn Hong Kong over to the Chinese in 1997, and they did. That was negotiated with Deng Xiaoping, and it was going to be one country with two systems. And that lasted until about 2 years ago. You were following the news in Hong Kong. This is people protesting Chinese takeover of the island. They've put new laws enforcing Chinese laws on the island. They've eliminated the free press. Anybody who's a dissident was hauled back to China and put in jail. So the whole economic climate in Hong Kong has changed. And meanwhile, people in Taiwan are watching this and saying, well, if they do that in Hong Kong, we really can't believe anything they say. We'll end up like Hong Kong if we reunite with China. Meanwhile, there's North Korea also on the border with China, and China has done nothing about North Korea developing all their nuclear weapons. They're using it as a way to harass us. They're letting North Korea do this. So it's another flashpoint between us and China, and North Korea is very capable about playing the United States and China off against each other as they develop their nuclear capability. And finally, there's the 3.7 million jobs that have moved out of the United States. So we have a lot of things that we don't agree with the Chinese these days. Some of them could lead to military confrontation. When we look at their military balance of power, this is probably one of the scarier slides I'm going to show you tonight. This is a 2021. You can see China's been building aircraft carriers a long ways from the United States. They're building cruisers, submarines, airplanes. And this is China has all their forces concentrated in East Asia, and we have our forces concentrated all over the world. And as you know, a lot of our military assets are now deployed in the Middle East. So the concern is that China's getting stronger and stronger in East Asia. And, we're not really prepared to deal with it. And these are old numbers. They're constantly changing. And meanwhile, China's embarked on this very big nuclear buildup. This is a slide from 2023, just like a few months ago. Xi Jinping has, here he is in military uniform. You don't see our presidents, well, we had one president got in a military uniform one day, but we usually don't see our president in military uniforms. And here he is in a Navy uniform. There's other pictures of him at Army parades. And he's inspecting the troops, and he's announced that he's going to reunify with Taiwan in 2027. So that's a concern, for sure, because we promised that we're not going to let them do that unless they agree to do it peacefully. So I don't mean to scare you, but this is kind of a worrisome situation. So much for the peaceful rise of China. That's what was the argument in the 80s. So we could go on a massive buildup to change the equation here. We could go on a massive buildup and build more aircraft carriers and cruisers and so on. But we have a little problem, and that is, as a country, our debt to GDP has risen from 40% to 60% in the early 2000s to now we're more than 120% of GDP, our debt to GDP. So we don't like, we're basically bankrupt. We're not in a position to go on a massive military buildup against China. So our fearless leaders come up with other strategies, which we're going to discuss tonight. And there's a consensus in Washington that we have to de-risk from China. And what that means, because the military balances become unfavorable, people I know who are have kids in the service, and they're all preparing kids are being trained to fight a war with China, not a war with Russia, not a war in the Middle East. Our force structure is not prepared for China. We have lost our competitiveness. China's involved in a mercantile expansion, so they settled on this idea of denying China key technologies, because the things that China uses to run their military, they don't make themselves. They're made in the West by us or by our allies. So the idea is to deny technology to China. And leading the pack is Wisconsin's own Mike Gallagher. He's a representative from Green Bay in Congress. Does anybody know of him?
Yeah.
Heard of him?
Yes.
He's running this committee. This is a picture from a year ago, 2023. It's February 2023. It's almost exactly 1 year ago. And he's running a bipartisan committee on investigating what China's doing about getting U.S. technology and U.S. investment and putting the spotlight on it and trying to change it. His quote is, "We shouldn't be funding our own destruction." That's a quote from Mike Gallagher. Okay. And there seems to be a bipartisan agreement, however you feel about China and whether you're a Republican or Democrat, there seems to be a bipartisan agreement, and there's definitely bipartisan participation in this his committee. One of the few areas where maybe the Republicans and Democrats agree. Another scholar wrote in Foreign Affairs recently, in the last year, that China's actions are part of a coordinated campaign of mercantilist aggression to capture global leadership in advanced technologies by stealing technologies and propping up state champions with massive subsidies. So that's the war we're in. We're in kind of a technology war with China. We have an edge, and we're trying to protect our edge. That's really the theme tonight of tonight's talk. If you look at the military defense semiconductor market, it's a pretty big market. It's $25 billion last year, and it's expected to grow to $55 billion. And this just shows where some of the money is going. And the North American share of that market is 35%. But in every defense system uses these integrated circuits. This book talks a lot about how they got their way into the defense products from the Vietnam War going forward. And the first Gulf War, the one we fought against Saddam Hussein, our military was so effective with these smart weapons. It shocked the Chinese how we could, with precision targeting, take out all these targets very efficiently. It was frightening to them when they realized how far advanced our military was over theirs. And it was really due to our use of semiconductors and these smart weapons. Meanwhile, chip production has been shifting away from the United States. You can see that here. In 1990, we had about close to 40% of the world production in chips, and Europe had more than there are our allies, and Asia had less. Now this year, we're talking about the United States is less than 20% share. Taiwan is probably the biggest share. China's growing, but these are low-tech chips. All the high-tech chips now are mostly made in Taiwan. And that's expected to change, and China's trying to catch up on the high-tech chips. This phone cannot be made with the chips that are being made in China right now. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So the leader in this has emerged is this company called TSMC. Has anybody heard of TSMC? Company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. It's run by a guy named Morris Chang. He was a refugee from China as a child. His life's talked about in this book. He ends up in the United States, and he's working with the guys with Moore's Law, and Andy Grove, all of Intel fame. They all started at a company called Fairchild. That's where he learned semiconductors and Texas Instrument. And he eventually moved back to, he was enticed to join, he wasn't from Taiwan, but he was lured to Taiwan, got mad at his boss in the United States and went to Taiwan, and he set up TSMC. And they've become the world leader in advanced semiconductors. The competition is who can put more transistors on a chip than anybody else. And what's happening is these transistors are getting miniaturized. They talk about 10 nanometer, the gap between transistors of 10 nanometers, and 8 and 5. Now people are making a 3 nanometer chip. That's in these advanced cell phones that they can just squeeze in more and more semiconductors. And that's where all the horsepower is in this phone that makes us do so many wonderful things. And the strategy that TSMC has is quite novel. They're saying rather than, we're not going to be in the business of designing a computer chip and then selling it to the computer makers to put in their computer, rather we're going to be the experts at making chips. So Apple came to Intel and said, we want you to manufacture a chip for our iPhone. They said, we don't want to do that. We only make chips for our own equipment. And they ended up going to TSMC, and Apple's design is being produced in TSMC's factories. And over time, all the productions have shifted to TSMC, where the designs are made in the United States or Europe or wherever they're being made, and China. TSMC makes chips for China, and then they are shipped back to their customers for integration into whatever product is being used. This is a really big change. So Intel was and still is vertically integrated. So they make the production of the chips, and they design them, they make them, and then they sell them. That's changed with what TSMC is doing, and they've been able to have much better efficiencies. So Congress got really alarmed that we're about to have a war with China over Taiwan, and all the advanced chips are made in Taiwan. We better figure out how to get some production back in the United States. And that's what led in 2022 to the CHIPS Act. Has anybody heard of that? That's what led to the CHIPS Act. And that called for $280 billion investment in chips and science. It was, again, bipartisan, and it was to rebuild U.S. technology manufacturing leadership. And everybody was in on it, and it's hard to say whether how it will go, but they've got Intel, for example, has launched a $20 billion new factory in Ohio, and TSMC has been lured to come back to the United States. As I said, this Morris Chang worked originally in Arizona with Fairchild and Texas Instrument, so he was familiar with Arizona, and they're building a big factory in Arizona. It's called a fab. The places that make chips are called fabs, which I think stands for fabrication center, fabrication factory, but the slang in the industry is a fab. So they're investing in this big fab in Arizona, and others are investing. I just put two up as examples here. Excuse me. So now we get to what is a technology denial strategy. It's a logical move to block China's predatory practices. And the Biden administration took off where the Trump administration left off to increase controls and limit transfer of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. That's what the technology denials. We're not going to let them get the advanced technology to put in their weapons to be used against us. That's the whole idea. They're trying to limit China's ability to project power and limit its military expansion. The thing that's attractive about it, it's a way to try to block what China's doing and not get ourselves into a war. It's a non-confrontational way to go about it. But the Chinese, of course, really don't like it. They call it containment. We're trying to hurt China's growth. Another example, colonialism by the big Western powers. So they're very unhappy about that, and they're pushing back. At the same time, they're trying to figure out how to design around our embargoes. So we come down to this thing called the entity list. What is the United States entity list? This is a list that guys like me worry a lot about. If a company is on the entity list, there's another list for countries, and somebody in my organization takes an order, and we ship a product to a company that's on that entity list, my company can get fined, and we can even lose our export license. When I was in China, one of my partners took an order in Sudan from a company we weren't supposed to be doing business with, and I found out about it. I had to shut it down real quickly before we got in trouble. So we put a bunch of companies on the entity list, a bunch of Chinese companies on the entity list to forbid them from buying American products. And these are the key technologies we're trying to block to these companies. So we've put we're blocking investment in the Chinese tech sector, and we focused on these three areas: quantum computing, which I don't even understand what that is, but anyway, it's the latest thing in computing. Advanced chips that run all these things, and artificial intelligence, which is the new hot thing. We've all heard about ChatGPT. Well, artificial intelligence, basically, decisions in wartime are going to be run by computers. My computer against your computer. Things happen so fast that humans can't be involved in making decisions. For example, in these missile attacks, I think a lot of this is automatic defenses that are being done. And our national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, characterizes our strategy by limiting it to these three technologies. They call it the small yard, just a couple technologies, and high fence. We're going to block, that's what the slang is. I don't know if the Chinese appreciate the metaphor, but it's for national security, we're going to have these investment restrictions on American companies. We're not allowed to sell, our companies are not allowed to sell anything to anybody who's on the entity list. We also go off after our allies to also cooperate on that. So tech remains the central part in the hot piece between China and the United States. We all smile and say nice things to each other, but in fact, there's a very intensive competition right now. And the company that we really focus on, we the United States, has been Huawei. It's H-U-A spelled Huawei, and Hua can mean a lot of things, but one of the things it means is flower. And that's where this logo for this company comes from. When we talked about Africa, two great decisions ago, Huawei was the #1 supplier of telecommunications equipment in Africa. It's not as high tech as this equipment used here, but it's very cost effective, and they have the whole Africa market. And Huawei was about to get a contract from Britain to upgrade the telecommunications in England, and the United States put a lot of pressure on the UK not to give back the contract and not do business with Huawei. Huawei is also building cell phones to compete with Apple. We had really shut down Huawei, denied all the chips they need for their phones, and we've gone after all their Western customers, all the different countries that were enticed by the good pricing from Huawei, and quite frankly, some very good technology for these 5G telephone systems, and we forced them to not do business with Huawei. Huawei is a state actor in China. I don't know if you remember, about a year and a half ago, the founder of Huawei's daughter was detained in Vancouver. She was under house arrest for about 2 years over some deals where they illegally supplied products with American chips in it to Iran. Eventually, the deal was cut between Biden and she was released from detainment in Vancouver. So there's been a real focus on Huawei. It's been quite aggressive by the United States. Another one is NVIDIA. Now, have you heard of NVIDIA? It's just in the news in the last 6 months or so. Anybody own any NVIDIA stock? Yeah, I bet you're really smiling. It's going crazy.
Every day.
What's that?
Every day.
Every day, good. Well, NVIDIA makes these things called GPUs, which stands, that acronym in this case stands for Graphical Processing Units. They're used in games. NVIDIA makes chips so kids can play games. On your PlayStation, they're all run by NVIDIA chips. And the thing they use is called parallel processing. Most computers use serial processing, one calculation, next calculation. Well, parallel processing, they do all the many calculations in parallel. So for each step, they can do a lot more calculations per step. And that's what these chips were originally designed for. But the amount of computing power needed in artificial intelligence made this type of parallel processing chip ideal for these parallel processing systems, and this found its way into data centers. So the concern is we want data centers is where all this artificial intelligence is being developed. So the United States is trying to control anything that helped the Chinese with data centers. So we put restrictions on NVIDIA chips to be shipped to China. So what did NVIDIA do? They said, okay, our limitation is this much. We can't do, I'm not explaining the technical limitations, I don't know what it is. But they redesigned their chip to circumvent the export controls, so to work around it. So China's still getting these chips. Maybe they're not quite as capable as the original chips, but they're still pretty capable. The other thing that's going on is to make these advanced chips that are being made at TSMC. They rely on a technique. They rely on something called lithography. They make a picture of. They design a circuit so we can see it with the human eye. Then instead of projecting it into a magnifying glass, and we make it larger. If you do it the other way, it comes out of the magnifying glass the other way. It makes it smaller. So they shrink the image down, and they use lasers to make what's called lithographic etching of these chips. Very advanced machines to do that. All that technology was created in the United States, originally funded by Intel. It's taken over by a company in Holland. Oops, did that wrong. Oops. And called ASML. And they make these advanced lithography machines that are used to etch the chips. And the only people that make the most advanced ones in the world are ASML. Nikon also makes them. I think the ones in Holland are considered more advanced. So we're trying, our government is trying to make sure that these machines don't go to China. So they blocked the exports in 2023, but it didn't come into effect until the end of until this January. Meanwhile, the Chinese imported about 65% more lithography equipment than they had in the previous year, because they're trying to load up on this kind of equipment. This is what they need to manufacture chips in China that can compete with the really super high density semiconductors. So as I said, ASML is a company in the Netherlands, but the Netherlands, part of NATO, and the United States government pressed the Netherlands to block the exports of this equipment to China. And the key component in this is a laser made by a company called Seymour in California that makes this extreme ultraviolet laser that's used for this etching. And they're etching down, the goal is to 3 nanometers. It's smaller than a coronavirus cell, my understanding from reading what I've been reading. So it's incredibly microscopic. And the key component is made in California, and that's sold to ASML. But ASML has since then bought this company, so it's owned by this Dutch company, but run in California. But as you see, all the key technology is still in the West. So let's look at the world for a second. I had fun putting this slide together, trying to think about how to explain all this. So if you're into electronics, Apple has their headquarters out in California, so does Google and Amazon. Their engineers are designing these chips. There's 3 companies that make the software for the design. They're all Western companies. The engineers work in their offices and design the integrated circuits that go in these chips. They then send this design all the way around the world. They send it west over the Pacific, all the way to little old Taiwan, right up the coast of China. Imagine these ships tend to be able to computer file electronically, I'm guessing. And then that goes to TSMC, and TSMC takes that design and manufactures the chip for Amazon, for Apple, for Intel, for Google. They're all making the chips there at TSMC. And then TSMC ships this chip to China, to Southeast Asia, and these chips are assembled in these countries because they're labor intensive. So they use low labor there, the low labor prices there, and that's where the assembly is done. And then they ship the chip. The chip goes into this iPhone, and then is assembled in China, and then it's with the chips made in Taiwan that are designed in California, and then they're sent back to the consumers in the United States. The supply chain for making these chips is also interesting. As I said, the advanced lasers made in California, that's shipped to Holland. They make the lithography machine that makes the photo etching. That's how these chips are manufactured. And then that's shipped back to TSMC. So TSMC can, that equipment that is used to manufacture the chips. Now the interesting thing about here is if you want to make China, let's see if I can get this working. If you want to give China a hard time, you can stop the shipment of this laser, you can stop the shipment of this machine, you can prevent China from making chips for TSMC, block TSMC from manufacturing chips for China. These are all the places where we're doing the technology denial against China. So China is firmly opposed to being the inclusion of, this is a slide from 2019, where 28 companies were on the entity list. I think it's more than that since then. These are 28 Chinese companies that American companies are not allowed to sell to. And there's all kinds of technology export controls. This remains a core battle with Beijing, trying to prevent the Chinese from getting the 7 nanometer or smaller chips. I said the game is now on to make 3 nanometer chips. And we prohibited US citizens from working for China Semiconductor. When we were in China, my wife's friend's husband worked for one of the Chinese semiconductor companies. So this is around 2008 or 2009. And they were way behind us. But he was an American working in China for a semiconductor company. I was an American working in China for a power systems company. Japan and Netherlands have blocked the sale of this equipment the manufacturing equipment to China. Japan is Nikon, Netherlands is ASML. And Jake Sullivan refers to this as this small yard, high fence strategy. There's been a 22% decline in import of semiconductors into China as a result of these actions. That's what the technology denial is all about. There's more to this. One of the largest venture capital companies investing in high tech is a company called Sequoia. Has anybody heard of Sequoia? Has heard of it, yeah. So if I had some extra money, maybe like Dennis, a couple $1 million I wanted to invest, I would put it into venture capital. A company called Sequoia, and they would go and find out about Chinese high tech companies. They research them all. They invest in them, and U.S. venture capital companies are connected to 700 Chinese companies. These are all the things that Mike Gallagher's committee is investigating. Sequoia has a $100 billion fund that people, Americans are putting money into. People around the world are putting money into. They built a database for 40 years, over 1,000 high-tech Chinese startups. The United States government, as a result of these hearings, has forced Sequoia to separate its operations from China. This is the leader of Sequoia, Neil Shen. He was probably a Tiananmen Square Chinese. A lot of Chinese showed up in the United States after Tiananmen Square in the early 90s. And he uses his language skill. He probably has a PhD in engineering, and he goes around and finds out what are good investments. We know some people that are doing this. This is, this is how they end up finding good employment with their language and their engineering skills. So he was forced to spin off his China operations. The United States government forced him to spin off his China operations. There's another company called GGB Capital, same thing. They were forced to spin off their Chinese operations. To separate their money that was going into China, make sure it was not coming from the United States. I don't know. Money's quite fluid. I don't think they can really control where money goes. But anyway, it was a nice try. Meanwhile, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, some of you, including me, have Vanguard in our retirement funds. And Vanguard owns some of these high-tech companies in China. So it means that we all have a little bit of Vanguard, perhaps in our retirement portfolio. One of the big companies is Xi'an Aircraft Aviation Company. Xi'an is this company is like the Boeing of China for military aerospace applications, and that's in Vanguard's portfolio. Another one is Beijing Highlander, that's using naval electronics. So the United States is trying to force these companies, these big companies, to separate their investment, not buy these into these portfolios. So we get into what foreign direct investment is in China. It's grown quite a bit over, this is through 2020, you see it's up to $144 billion. And it's been increasing, but more recently, as a percent of GDP, of Chinese GDP, the foreign investment's getting smaller and smaller. And this past year was the first time that foreign direct investment into China went negative, and that's by a result of all these actions. So these actions are having an impact on China. And if you're paying attention to the financial news, if you read the Wall Street Journal, for example, you'll see there's all kinds of stuff about how bad the Chinese economy is doing. In fact, just now, I get a newsletter from Asia every morning Asia time, got it just a couple hours ago, that the finance minister of China was fired because of this and the falling Chinese economy. The Chinese stock market's in big trouble. There's a lot of companies in debt that are collapsing, and these efforts to take the money out and reduce investment in China are having an impact on the Chinese economy. I keep wondering if Xi Jinping really made the right decision on the approach he took, because China was booming during the early years I was there. And we often wonder why he took such a militaristic approach. I think they're paying a price for it. So we're back to Wisconsin's Representative Mike Gallagher. Now it's only a month ago, less than a month ago, he's having more hearings, and he calls in the top guys from Intel, NVIDIA, and Micron, and probably others, and for hearing about what they're doing and how, to make sure they're not circumventing these investment rules and these export rules like NVIDIA was doing into China. He says, and he comments, you don't defeat an adversary by shoveling millions of dollars into their military programs. That was one of the quotes from hearing. I guess it's good politics but it is an important issue. So the policy dilemma, here's some quotes from different people. The U.S. has been in decades-long engagement with China. It may have been the worst strategic blunder any country's made in recent history. There's no comparable example of a great power actively fostering the rise of a peer competitor. It's pretty strong stuff. I don't know if I completely agree with it. People talk about the peaceful rise of China. Chinese leaders may have their ambitions, but the ordinary people in China they're not interested in war, I can tell you that. If national security is left to the corporate boardroom, we've all be speaking Chinese tomorrow. Well, I speak a little bit, but not very well. And China has one powerful friend left in the US, and that's Wall Street. So that's what these politicians are zeroing in on. But the question is, will technology denial backfire? That's what the questions in the Great Decisions are about. Because the loss of the Chinese market may leave US companies less competitive, because competition is good. It forces you to improve your products, improve your processes, and get better. And if we don't have competition, we're protected. And suddenly when we do have competition, we're not ready for it. So, and how will China react to this sanctions regime? So a lot of people are asking this question. Apple is one company that really depends on China. As I said before, 95% of Apple's production is in China, 20% of its iPhone sales are in China. Look at this. Their iPhones have more share of the market than Huawei's iPhones. Well, that may change, but they are very reliant on China. As soon as the travel restrictions on coronavirus restrictions are going to China were lifted, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, right away to Beijing to kowtow before the authorities there and try to keep the relationship going. But again, all their products are made in China. They can't move it. It's very hard to move this stuff. So you get down to this question: is containment technology? Is technology denial a good long-term strategy? Well, this is our Secretary of Commerce. Her name is Gina Raimondo. She was visiting China last September, trying to assure the Chinese that we still love you, we still want to do business with you, we still want to sell you any of our advanced chips. And meanwhile, Huawei has announced while she was there that they have a new chip for their phone that was built in China that can match the performance of the Apple phone. So it's hard to contain this stuff. The Chinese are busy creating patents at a far faster rate than we in the West are. They're innovative, hardworking people. There's a company called SMIC. This is a company in Shanghai called Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation. Most of the China government's investment is going into Huawei, but recently it's going in SMIC, and that's where those laser machines now are going, is SMIC, to make these chips so that they can have products that are being embargoed by the United States. And I just picked this slide up yesterday, February 6th. I added this to my presentation at the last minute. Look at the headline here. China, the cusp of next generation chip. SMIC and Huawei plan to make a 5-nanometer processor. They're doing it with their own stuff. Well, they did get those machines from ASML. So it's a very quickly moving world. It's going to be very hard to slow them down for very long. That's really what this is trying to show. So meanwhile, people want to say, we don't want to do any business from China. I love this quote from Janet Yellen. The Chinese have great respect for her. She also visited last September. Biden administration sent everybody in the whole cabinet to China to say, we still want to do business with you. We don't want war. We just don't want you buying our chips to put in your smart weapons. But Yellen says decoupling from China would have disastrous consequences for the world economy. And I think that's true when you see how much stuff we use from China. So I recommend this book. If you want to learn more about chip war, I sure learned about this book, a lot from this book. It was the Financial Times Business Book of the Year 2 years ago. And there's a copy here that Jennifer has if anybody wants to take it out tonight. We're doing an advertisement. I don't get commission. And that leads me back to the questions. Is China a national security threat or a business opportunity? Can it be both? If China is a national security threat, should a U.S. denial strategy attempt to slow China's overall development or just its military development? If China is a national security threat and a technology denial strategy is appropriate, how can the United States get companies like NVIDIA and ASML to cooperate and not try to figure out how to work around the sanctions? should U.S. investors and their asset managers be prohibited from buying any and owning any Chinese defense companies? You know, it might be helping my 401k. Should we give up that profit from our 401k? If China's a business opportunity, are there no products that we should be sold to China? Where should the line be drawn? And is the United States in a new Cold War with China? So that is that, and I'm gonna, I think that's the last of my, let's see if I can get back here. Oops. That's the end of my presentation, and I really wanted to hear what you guys had to say.
Well, I'm gonna sleep like a baby tonight. Probably not.
Exactly.
I'm not gonna sleep like a baby tonight.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. The real problem comes when we flip those questions.
Okay.
Rephrase those questions, then it becomes a problem for us.
Please.
Can we afford to lose China? That is one question. Is China only benefiting from us, not we benefiting from, you already mentioned that we are also benefited from China, so we cannot completely abandon. Second thing you talked about was Taiwan. We will not allow China to annihilate Taiwan, but we allow other countries to go for it. You know, I don't know, one of them is India. Third thing is, when you talked about bankrupt, we are bankrupt, you mentioned, but we are giving away our tax dollars to foreign countries as a foreign aid. When we ourselves need money for domestic needs, why should we give money to foreign countries? Then you also talked about Uyghur open air prison, but we allow other countries to have open air prison. So these type of questions, when they are directed towards us, what will be your approach?
I think you should come up here and take over. You raise very good points. That's my comment. I personally think, as I said, I think sanctions have very limited benefits in the long term. So that's my answer. But right now, the United States, the Congress, the United States is really on a China bashing strategy. It starts with those points that third or fourth slide I had showing all the different areas of controversy or differences between the United States and China. It's quite a substantial list of tensions.
This may be off topic, but you showed the slide about how much in debt we are.
Yeah.
How much of our debt is held by China?
A lot, but I don't know the percentage.
And how would that affect all of these situations that you're talking about?
Well, that's why Janet Yellen says decoupling would be very dangerous to do, but it would be very dangerous for everybody. The truth is, we're really interconnected with each other. They need us and we need them.
If globalization were to be the norm in the future, would a lot of these problems not exist?
Well, I think it's not globalization that's creating these problems. It's rivalry between big powers.
You're saying the multinationals, and that's what I call globalization, whereas
Yeah.
there is no allegiance to this country.
That's
if
right.
you are multinational, if you do not go and allow us to trade, we will just headquarters in a country that is more favorable to our profitability.
And that's what we're forcing these venture capital companies to do.
Is that unpatriotic? Is that almost treasonous? Or are those words unallowable under the scope of, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America? When you become a globalist, do you go and relinquish that? A globalist in manufacturing.
You relinquish what you're.
Yeah. Do you relinquish?
Our system, we benefit from global. I'm a great believer that we benefit from globalization. your product, you have more products available, more diverse, they cost you less money. China has been the biggest source of deflation in the global economy over the last 20 years. That's the flip side that I didn't talk about. Now, with that deflation, it had a cost. The cost goes really to labor in the United States and other countries.
The beneficiaries of those low costs are your common people and not your
It's
1
you.
or 3%.
That's the
Right.
jacket you're wearing.
Right, it has no effect on the 1 and 3%ers. Yeah, okay.
It's easy to fall into China bashing, and I just wanted to present this today. What the article was, and I also wanted to see what's going on in Congress. This is really being driven by these hearings in Congress and by the Biden administration. Because we really are in this, I always like to say, the talk I gave last year was basically about the American Pacific Empire, which expanded, our Western movement expanded from our 13 colonies to California, to Hawaii, to the Philippines, and after World War II to the shores of Asia. That's our empire. Now the Chinese and other Asian countries are trying to push us back. We don't want to leave. We don't want to give up our position in the world.
It's not so much China bashing as it is that how when did the light bulb go on in America that these chips, which are sensitive for military applications and that have the possibility to disrupt the economy of the United States if there was a flaw in the chip? Is it only within about the last 3 years that this came to light, that the United States and our elected officials finally came to the conclusion that adversary of philosophy from the United States, China communists, no matter which way they want to go and form their capitalist society, whether it be communist or democracy, is it that they finally came to the conclusion that China has been known to have the 100-year outlook on where they want to be in 100 years, and the U.S. is such a short-term horizon for where we want to be profitability-wise, and is then China a big foe that is in disguise, that we've got these relationships and we need your trade and everything, but their 100-year plan is much different than our 5-year plan, and even with the loss of the reserve currency and the petrodollar status that seems to be taking place in the Asia Pacific, is that a part of the plan to capture more of the market?
By the Chinese?
Right.
Well, they have lots of ambitious plans, but they got so many problems of their own.
We have a question over here.
Yes, sir.
Couple things. I've recently read that book, and it is excellent. My take in reading that, and just let me make a comment. I think we need China. They need us. I think the playing field has been tilted in their favor. I think we're trying to get it back to where it should be, 50-50. I think that's positive that we're moving in that direction. When I read that book, the thing that impressed me the most was, I think the key players is ASML.
Right.
Those machines are $100 million, and you cannot make advanced semiconductors without them. They're the only place that makes them. Taiwan Semiconductor and Intel and all the rest of those companies, they need ASML, and who's ever got ASML is going to be the leader. And the restriction that they place, I think, is really, really key for the AI purposes and defense purposes.
Yeah, the battle suddenly, we all learned about it with ChatGPT in the last year. The battle over AI is, the gun has been fired, the race is on. This advanced chips are the critical part of AI.
You mentioned in your talk, and I just remember from 25 years ago, the justification or hope of economic engagement with China was that their political system would be changed by that economic engagement.
Correct, yes.
And at least to this point, that has kind of turned out not to be true. In your experience, working in China and knowing people who are engaged, with China, is that viewpoint completely dead? That we can influence their political system by economically engaging? Have people just sort of fallen into the idea that we are like in a new Cold War with them?
What do you mean, by people or governments? Our government certainly believes we're in a new Cold War with them. I think individuals, it's easy to stir people up with national issues. I can still remember, one early memory is being in one of our factories in Arkansas and watching, and all our engineers sitting at a lunch table watching us fire missiles at the Iraqis in the Second Gulf War. It's like going to a football game. Well, fast forward 10 or 15 years later, I'm in China at a dinner and the TV's on, and they're watching their Coast Guard ships shooting high pressure fire hoses at Japanese ships over some fishing islands off the coast between China and Korea and Japan. So it's easy to get people, and the Chinese are all stirred up. Well, that's our place. The China Sea is is China. They said, why do you say it's China? They said, look at the name. The name is the China Sea. Never mind, it doesn't comply with the law of international maritime laws. So it's easy to get populations stirred up. That's the biggest danger, I think. And our population is getting stirred up by stuff I've showed you today. There has to be a balance somewhere in the middle, don't you think?
If we take the Chinese leadership at their word, and it is truly their goal to bring Taiwan back into the fold by 2027, is part of the CHIPS Act essentially a race to 2027 to make Taiwan irrelevant and have all of the chip manufacturing here as best we can? Is that even possible?
I question whether it's possible, but certainly that's the aspiration. I mean, to get one of those factories running probably takes 10 years to get it running properly. And the speed at which the technology changes, we could build those factories, and by the time we put them in production, they may be obsoleted by newer technologies. It's entirely possible. The government getting involved in technology investment, I think, is risky. Not doing anything is also risky. That's why we have great decisions.
What do the Chinese, if you have any insight, what do the Chinese see as threats to their national security? Like, I don't know that I imagine, Korea or North Korea attacking China. Like, what are they worried about in terms of their national security? Like, I don't know that they have any sort of great power competitors next door to them that are so threatening. So what would make them feel cornered geopolitically?
That was my last talk. If you look at a map of China, I don't remember the exact number. They have approximately 12 countries on their border. So they are very worried about managing their relationship with all the countries on their border, whether it's India, North Korea, Russia, or Vietnam. So we have two countries on their border. We have very friendly relationships with both of them. So they're very worried about that. They feel that they've been historically wronged. They're by what happened in the 19th century, the colonial wars, the Opium Wars, World War II, the Sino-Japanese War. So they feel that they've been wrong, that Taiwan was taken away from China by a treaty with Japan in 1894. And then in 1945, Chiang Kai-shek, when the war was over, the United States government gave Taiwan to Chiang Kai-shek's armies, but in 1949 he retreated to Taiwan. They view it as that the Civil War is not resolved, the same way Vietnam views South Vietnam was an unresolved part of their Civil War, and Korea views South Korea as an unresolved part of their Civil War. So China still feels that there's been historically wrong, and they nurture that feeling in their education system and in their museums. I'm giving a talk at Osher about that next month, about that exact subject, how they look at these wars in the 19th century and how they affects their attitudes in the 20th century. So they're alarmed by us taking away, blocking the technology. They're alarmed about it. They need us for trade. They want us to be good trading partners and give them what they need, but they also need our marketplace. So, the economic investment's serious enough that they fired their Janet Yellen got fired this morning. So.
With all the involvement between China and the United States, business-wise, and not military, but business-wise, do you really think if China invades Taiwan, the United States is going to really do anything, from your perspective?
Somebody said yes. Yeah.
Do you really think so?
Why do you think so?
We have too much economic ties with China for the.
It's the last button that they're, it's the last straw.
From my experience, I spent a lot of time in Taiwan. My experience with Taiwanese is they're enjoying their life. I would characterize them, and also characterize a lot of the Chinese I know as lovers, not fighters. So I question whether the Taiwan people would actually fight back. I think they're relying on the umbrella of the United States defense. Once again, we find ourselves defending a country where the people don't want to defend themselves.
I don't think the people in this country are going to defend somebody who's going to defend themselves. We can hardly defend
we're good at
ourselves.
getting into lots of wars, so I don't know. We're gearing up to defend Taiwan. If you talk to people who have kids in the military, that's what they're training for.
We have time for one more question. We all talked out.
These are not easy questions, and I don't have the answers. But I appreciate your comments tonight. Thank you. Thank you for having me. See you next year.